Welcome to another lecture. Today we are going to talk about the police organization and structure of Canada. Some of the components of today's lesson will cover how Canadian policing evolved from the 1800s till how it's delivered today. We'll describe the different urban and rural policing arrangements and the agencies that deliver these services. We will also identify some possible reasons for the differences in police strength, as well as describe the five roles of police in Canada. Why don't we begin with a case study? So, when it comes to investigating crimes, the story of the 15-year-old Tina Fontaine comes to mind. So, Tina Fontaine drew international attention to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women. On August 17, 2014, Tina's body, which had been wrapped in a duvet weighed down with rocks, was found in the Red River near Winnipeg. So, Tina, originally from northern Manitoba, had traveled to Winnipeg to visit her birth mother, and in her 6 weeks in the city, she had come to the attention of police officers and security officers, hospital staff, and child and family services. She was declared a missing person by her hometown RCMP on the July 10th, 2014, and Child and Family Services (CFS) placed her in a hotel. But she left shortly thereafter. The staff were not allowed to physically stop her from leaving, and she was reported missing four more times in the next few weeks. Tina was hospitalized after being found unconscious on the street on August 8, 2014, and returned to the CFS placement. On August 9th, she again left the hotel and was not seen afterward. Family members contend that the vulnerable teenager fell through the cracks in the systems that were supposed to protect her. A report from the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth 2019 highlighted how the police, health officials, and care workers failed to act in the days before her murder, despite her involvement in risky behaviors and the fact that she was being sexually exploited. The report also found that she required better care and support to her 2014 trip to Winnipeg. On the 8th of December 2015, Winnipeg police charged 53-year-old Raymond Cormier, a man with 92 previous criminal convictions, with Fontaine's murder. Cormier had allegedly been giving the teenager drugs, and police recordings played in court suggest that he had sex with her. Despite having circumstantial evidence suggesting his guilt, Cormier was found not guilty of Fontaine's murder in February 2018. So Indigenous groups were outraged that this young woman's murder had gone unpunished. So critical scholars such as De Finney in 2017 observed that Tina Fontaine's murder shows how Indigenous girls are dehumanized, exploited, and portrayed as dispensable damaged goods. So why couldn't the criminal justice system produce justice for Tina Fontaine? Unlike what we see depicted in television and films, there was almost no evidence linking the suspect to the murder, and a pathologist could not even conclusively say she had been murdered after even an autopsy that lasted 2 days. Bordbeck in 2018 said the prosecution had a weak case and there was no confirmed cause of death, no crime scene, and very little to glean forensically from Tina's body. There were no witnesses who saw Tina's killer, and there was no forensic evidence linking Cormier to her. With respect to the investigation, Bordbeck reports that the police engaged in a 6-month undercover operation they hoped would produce a confession. Prosecutors also used the testimony of Cormier's associates about comments he made about Fontaine, but he calls their testimony in courts highly suspect. In order for a person to be found guilty of a crime in Canada, the jury must find they are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A topic addressed, in several writings in law, a topic that's addressed in several law books, a topic that is addressed quite deeply within the Criminal Code of Canada. Tina Fontaine did not get justice, but it wasn't through lack of effort or diligence by police. They threw a ton of resources at this case, but they simply couldn't gather the evidence required to get a guilty verdict. The jury had no choice but to acquit. They did their job, and the justice system, including Justice Glenn Joyal, who presided over this case, did its job. So, some critical questions to think about. The police officers involved in this case spent thousands of hours in the investigation, but were unable to obtain enough evidence to secure a conviction. How does this match with our understanding of crime and police work from television? MacDonald in 2017 said that criminal trials may change the world, but it is never their goal. The only issue is proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So, should juries in crime trials consider the political outcomes of their decisions? Why do you think so, or why not? Also, what has the greater harm to society? A wrongful conviction of an innocent person, or an injustice because a guilty person is not found guilty? Would your answer change if the victim was a member of your family? Something to think about. So, getting into the lesson, there are about 2 police officers for every 1,000 Canadians, and about 2/3 of them are employed by municipalities. And most of us automatically think of the police in the role of controlling and responding to crime, although crime fighting accounts for only about 1/4 of their duties. The remainder of their time is spent in social service tasks, looking for lost children, investigating sudden deaths, and notifying family members, responding to complaints such as noisy parties or even barking dogs, as well as engaging in community policing activities such as providing crime prevention information to citizens or consulting with police advisory boards on local policing priorities. Traffic enforcement also accounts for a significant proportion of officer time, including issuing tickets and responding to collisions. We seldom consider that officers are also required to appear in court to testify and to attend training, and that these activities take them off the streets. With respect to their crime fighting role, the police in a democratic society must achieve a balance between enforcing the law and respecting the rights of the individuals they may encounter, whether they are suspects, victims, witnesses, or members of the public. In particular, dealing with suspects is not always an easy undertaking, as the public generally supports a tough on crime agenda but can become hostile to police officers who overstep legal or ethical boundaries. In complex and difficult to manage scenarios, such as responding to people with mental illness, officers may feel that they are in a lose-lose situation, as no matter what they do, their actions are criticized. Many of the situations the police encounter are due to shortcomings in the health, education, or social service sectors, what people call the social safety net. In some people, or in some places, the police have become the lead agency that deals with homelessness, mental illness, school discipline, youth unemployment, immigration, youth violence, sex work, and drugs. This is an example of mission creep, where organizations assume additional duties that were never envisioned by the founders of these agencies. As you learn more about today's lesson, ask yourself whether the police are the right agency to tackle these social problems. Marys in 2017 said that it is unfair to expect police to solve what is fundamentally a social safety net problem with the crude tools of crime fighting simply because they are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. Provinces have jurisdiction over policing, and they all have established set of legal guidelines that police services must follow. For example, in Ontario, a declaration of principles is outlined in the Police Services Act. The guiding principle is that the police are responsible for ensuring the safety and security of all people and property in the province while abiding by the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Charter. The need for cooperation between police services and the communities they serve is also highlighted. Other principles include the importance of being attentive to the needs of crime victims, respecting the multiracial and multicultural nature of Ontario's population is also recognized, including First Nation, Inuit, and Métis population. The declaration ends with an acknowledgement that police services need to be representative of the population they serve, and that all peoples must receive equitable levels of policing. Underlying all these principles is the goal of a healthy and mutually beneficial relationship between the public and the police, something that is easy to describe but very difficult to achieve. Police provide an important service to the public in terms of law enforcement, but as I discussed earlier, this aspect represents only a fraction of their work, and we often tend to overlook their other duties. Moreover, in recent years, there has been growing agreement that the police cannot go at it alone, and they rely on the public support in order to carry out their duties. In dozens of Saskatchewan and Ontario jurisdictions, for example, the police have introduced proactive crime control strategies that are intended to respond to the unmet needs of at-risk individuals and families, such as young people who are experimenting with alcohol and drugs, before they get into more serious trouble. Although we find that policing is slowly moving from reactive to proactive crime reduction strategies that are more likely to involve the community and focus on crime prevention. So, in order to illustrate what is happening with police organizations today in Canada, this lesson first presents a brief description of the evolution of policing, followed by a review of the structure of Canadian policing. There is a diverse range of police services in Canada, from smaller agencies employing fewer than 10 officers to larger provincial police services and the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The size of the agency, the professionalism of organizational leaders, and the training that officers receive shapes their interactions with the public and contributes to the success of frontline officers, also called rank and file officers, in crime prevention and control. So, speaking of the evolution of Canadian policing, policing has greatly transformed over the years as Canada has developed from a rural country that depended on agriculture to an industrialized urban nation with a diverse multicultural population. Cities have increased in population size largely due to rural residents moving from the countryside to cities, as well as immigration from other nations. These demographic shifts led to changes in the way that policing was carried out. For most of Canadian history, policing was undertaken by officers working in small town agencies with fewer than 10 officers. These small agencies evolved into larger, well-funded police services, and the officers working within them are now more representative of the communities they serve, as well as better trained and more professional. The big city police department, or large regional, provincial, and federal service, is now the norm, and there are fewer than 50 police services with less than 50 officers, and the number of these smaller departments is dropping every year. Policing has passed through a number of evolutionary stages, And this lesson will briefly highlight how these early influences set the stage for modern policing in Canada. This approach is useful for understanding the transition of policing from relatively small standalone police services, agencies that are not part of a larger organization, to today's larger services. So, the four stages we will talk about are the pre modern era, so prior to 1820, the political era between 1820 to 1940, the professional era, 1940 to 1980, and the community policing era, so 1980 to the present. And by taking a closer look at how policing arrangements evolved in Canada, we should be able to better understand today's policing arrangements. And the following will provide a brief overview of these four stages and explore how it led to the modern policing that we have in today's state. So, speaking of pre modern era, which is prior to 1820, so prior to the contact with the first English and European settlers, indigenous people had developed customary justice systems to resolve disputes and respond to wrongdoing. These justice systems were similar to the practice of indigenous people across the globe, where most disputes were resolved informally by tribal leaders, although some First Nations also had individuals who played a role in order maintenance. It is important to note that there was no one way that indigenous people confronted wrongdoers, as concepts of reconciliation, healing, and harmony differed across the nation. Um, there was a report by Jones, Ruddle, Nestor, Quinn, and Phillips in 2014, which stated that these justice systems often had a restorative approach and behaviors were controlled and regulated through shaming, ostracism, and compensation for a victim's loss. Some wrongdoings, however, were physically punished or executed, while others were banished from the community, which may have been an actual death sentence. These systems were in place before the lands that would become Canada were colonized by the English and European settlers. So the military was responsible for maintaining order in the first settlements prior to the Confederation in 1867. The British Navy, for instance, policed the Newfoundland coastal outposts, and British troops responded to crimes occurring on the land. As immigration increased throughout the 1700s and 1800s, people brought with them ideas of controlling crime that they had experienced in their homelands. Several Canadian municipalities claim to have had the first formal police service. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, founded in 1729, claims to be the oldest police service in Canada, although the town of York, which later became Toronto, is also credited as being one of the first Canadian police departments that deployed uniformed officers who were paid a salary rather than receiving fees for arrests. Now, moving on to the political era, which was between 1820 to 1940. So, speaking of this era, by the early 1800s, local politicians were instrumental in establishing policing services, and many of them used the police to further their interests, whether they were legal or not. One characteristic that was consistent across the small town and city police services is that they were often controlled by local political leaders, composed of mayors and council members or aldermen. In some places, the crimes of the rich and the politically powerful were overlooked, and the poor and members of minority groups were over-policed. In this era, police chiefs served at the will of mayors and council members, and they were sometimes directed by these political leaders to ignore certain types of offenses or suspects, for example, being asked to overlook the impaired driving of the mayor's supporters. If chiefs enforced the law against the wishes of their employers, they could be replaced by new chiefs who would carry out the wishes of the political matters, or political masters, I should say. Police officers who were also treated unfairly, and some were fired for enforcing the law, even when their actions were fair, lawful, and appropriate. As a result of this political interference, many officers working in small town police departments suffered from low morale and rapid turnover. That is, officers would not stay in these jobs for a long period of time. Although political leaders play a role in identifying crime problems and in prioritizing issues for police based or public concerns, the police have to be independent of an inappropriate political interference in order to have the trust and confidence of the public. How have the police done at avoiding inappropriate political interference? In the following lesson, the evolution of Canadian policing from a political to a professional model would be briefly described. Although the first settlers imported ideas about policing from their homelands, the policing arrangements that eventually developed in this country were distinctively Canadian. Now, North American police services were modeled after large municipal services that were first established in England and France in the 1820s and around 1830s. The French deployed uniformed officers in Paris by 1829. At about the same time, Sir Robert Peel founded London's Metropolitan Police Service with 1,000 full-time uniformed officers. The evolution of the London Police from an initial idea to a functioning agency took almost a decade due to public opposition to the police as they were thought to be a threat to liberty. In order to convince the public that the police were not an occupying army, constables patrolling the streets were unarmed, a tradition that still exists, although there are armed response teams today. Peel is considered to be the father of modern police service, and he introduced centralized command, the beat system, crime prevention, and the uniform. Peel's principles are widely cited throughout the literature and within the policing world. Policing was also occurring in the countryside. A rural police force modeled on the Royal Irish Constabulary (RIC) patrolled the Quebec countryside from 1839 to 1842, and a frontier police force was established in Ontario by 1864. Although there is little information about that service, the RIC influenced police organizations throughout Canada, as many former RIC officers held leadership positions in municipal and provincial police services, as well as the Northwest Mounted Police (NWMP). The need for formal social control on the prairies became apparent after the 1869 to 1870 Red River Rebellion, where Métis people in Manitoba engaged in an uprising against the government. Some call this the Red River Resistance. And following the Cypress Hills Massacre in 1873, when American hunters and whiskey traders participated in the massacre of 20 or more indigenous people in southern Saskatchewan. Although the NWPD was initially intended to be a temporary police force, it eventually became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in 1920. Because Canada was a rural nation, most policing prior to the 1940s occurred in small towns and the countryside, and rural and small town policing emerged in a patchwork fashion, meaning that there was very little consistency across the nation. The Police Association of Ontario in 2014 noted that the quality of policing depended very much on the political and financial priorities of the local municipal council. Few small municipalities could afford professional police services, and they experimented with different types of policing, such as hiring a town constable for a year or two or relying on part-time officers. But few written records exist to tell us the complete story about these early police organizations in Canada or elsewhere. But we do know, however, that for the most part, officers working for municipal police services were recruited locally and were poorly trained. They were overworked, 6-day work weeks were common, and they lacked job security, workers' compensation, or even pensions. While these officers worked long hours with few benefits, arrests were rare and most of their work was in response to relatively minor offenses such as public drunkenness, disorderly behavior, and vagrancy. During the political era, provincial police services were also established throughout the country to serve the rural areas and small towns, and the lifespan of these agencies were um, somewhat shorter. While each of the provinces has had one provincial police service, in the Canadian North was policed by the NWMP, which became the Royal North Mounted Police, or RNWMP, in 1904, and the RCMP in 1920. Even when the mounted police were posted in the Arctic in the early 1900s, their primary role was to ensure sovereignty, which is a nation's claim on its territory, rather than maintaining or fighting crime. While most of this discussion about the political era has centered around the inappropriate influences of local politicians on the police, provincial and federal politicians were also responsible for deploying the police in response to various threats. One example that ended in injuries and death is worthy of mention: the 1935 on the Ottawa Trek that started in Vancouver and ended in Regina. The On to Ottawa trek occurred during the Great Depression that started in 1929. In 1935, a group of unemployed men, many from federal relief camps, decided to travel by freight train from British Columbia to Ottawa to protest joblessness and poor working conditions, with the hope that the federal government would find them work. The movement increased in size as they traveled east until Prime Minister Bennett ordered that the trains be stopped in Regina, and the protesters set up camps there. Although a small group of individuals were permitted to meet with Bennett in Ottawa, talks quickly broke down and the men returned to Regina. On July 1st, the strikers and protesters had congregated in downtown Regina when they were confronted by armed RCMP and Regina police officers. When the dust from the riot cleared, one Regina police officer and a protester had been killed, 45 protesters and bystanders were injured, 100 rioters were arrested, and in his analysis of the Regina confrontation, Anastakis in 2015 observed that despite claiming to fight the Great Depression on behalf of ordinary Canadians, the state really remained squarely on the side of the employers, often with deadly consequences. So, going back to Sir Robert Peel and the main principles of policing, let's take a closer look at the references to Sir Robert's 9 principles in almost every policing book in today's time. So, in a review of these principles, Loader from the University of Oxford in 2016 speculates that the principles were written at least a century after Peel died, and that they were taken from newspaper accounts and Peel's speeches or writing. Peel's 9 principles of policing are as follows: 1. To prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. 2. To recognize always that the power of the police to fulfill their functions and duties is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions, and behavior, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect. 3. To recognize always that to secure and maintain the respect and approval of the public means also securing the willing cooperation of the public in the task of securing observance of the law. 4. To recognize always that the extent to which the cooperation of public can be secured diminishes proportionately the necessity of the use of physical force and compulsion for achieving police objectives. Point 5. to seek and preserve public favor, not by pandering to public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolutely impartial service to the law, in complete independence of policy, and without regard to the justice or injustice of the substance of individual laws, by ready offering of individual service and friendship to all members of the public without regard to their wealth or social standing, by ready exercise of courtesy and good humor, and by ready offering of individual sacrifice in protecting and preserving life. 6. To use physical force only when the exercise of persuasion, advice, and warning is found to be insufficient to obtain public cooperation to an extent necessary to secure observance of law or restore order, and to use only the minimum degree of physical force that is necessary on any particular occasion for achieving a police objective. 7. To maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and that the public are the police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. 8. To recognize always the need for strict adherence to police executive functions and to refrain from even seeming to usurp the power of the judiciary or avenging individuals or the state, and authoritatively judging guilt and punishing the guilty. Number 9. To recognize always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them. So despite the fact that these principles originated almost 200 years ago, they are still used to today's ideal police-community relationships. Now, moving over to the professional era, 1940 to 1980, I just got dyslexic there. I switch 19 by 80, so it's 1940 to 1980. The professional model of policing, also called the traditional model of policing, gradually replaced the political model that was seen in effective, corrupt, and brutal. Advocates of the professional model praised its objectivity, reliance on science, and freedom from political interference. In his analysis of Canadian policing, Robertson in 2012 noted the professional model sought to apply the benefits of new technology, especially in communications, to police a more mobile society. The professional model incorporated a centralized approach applying command and control techniques. This allowed for the introduction of random patrols with rapid response to calls for service. Standardization and training were emphasized to produce consistent service and results, limited individual initiative, and local variation. So, civil services were also introduced by political and police leaders to reduce cronyism and nepotism when friends and family members of police leaders were hired instead of the most qualified people on the job. This step increased the quality of officers, as did the introduction for formalized training at police academies. These ideas were revolutionary, as police officers were historically recruited from local towns and received little or no training prior to starting their jobs. Prior to establishment of policing standards, officers were often poorly equipped with only because uniforms or sidearms were not always supplied, even up until the 1970s in Nova Scotia. In some small towns, the only uniform that police officers received was an armband designating them as police officers, and they were also expected to use their personal vehicles as their departments did not own any. Most of the crimes confronted by small town officers were relatively minor, and antisocial behavior and public order offenses such as public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, rowdyism, and property offenses were the norm. Most of these offenses were handled informally, and few arrests were made. Police were typically hired on the basis of their physical size, and some suspects were beaten rather than arrested. According to a former police officer, the physical part of the job was more important than the brains. You had to beat heads first, then the public, respected you. So the idea of street justice, where suspected wrongdoers were beaten by the police and then released, was commonly applied, and while the individuals never received a criminal record for breaking the law, they never received any due process protections either. So, throughout the 1970s, political leaders increased the quality of policing by introducing provincial police standards, such as Manitoba's Police Services Act. These standards specified the hours of training required for new officers, the requirements of ongoing annual training for all officers, for example, first aid or firearms requalification, the types of equipment officers required, and the practices for detaining prisoners. Many small towns found it costly to comply with these requirements, and so they contracted with the OPP or CMP or SQ to provide policing services. OPP is the Ontario Provincial Policing Service, RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and SQ is Sûreté du Québec. A growing number of officers were also being represented by professional associations and police unions. The Police Association of Ontario, for instance, was established in 1933 to represent the interests of Ontario's officers. Similar organizations advocated on behalf of police officers throughout the country, and these efforts resulted in better working conditions and enabled collective bargaining. Although most Canadian officers are now represented by unions, officers and civilian members of the RCMP were not permitted to bargain collectively until January 2015, when the Supreme Court found the federal government's ban on their unionization was unconstitutional. Moving on to the community policing era, so 1980s to the present, 2023 or 2023. So by the 1980s, there was a growing awareness that the police needed to establish more productive relationships with communities and their stakeholders if they wanted to reduce crime. And police services started involving the public in their decision making, and those consultations revealed that issues of concern were sometimes unrelated to the crime, such as reducing visible signs of disorder, removing abandoned vehicles and graffiti, or confronting antisocial behavior. In addition, the public wanted to play a larger role in the oversight of the police by providing formal guidance to police services, and police advisory boards were being established throughout Canada. Today, most provinces require that police activities be overseen by these advisory committees or boards, also called the police management boards. Civilian involvement in police activities is a key part of community-oriented policing, although this is a catch-all term that refers to a number of strategies intended to bring the police and the public together, which was one of Beale's principles. The methods that police services have used to involve communities varies greatly, although most services have incorporated what Van Steeden, Miltenberg, and Bo Taylor called the 3 pillars of community policing. The first pillar is citizen involvement. The police consult the public about identifying and prioritizing community problems, including crime and disorder, problem solving, problem-oriented approach. The police analyze crime information and draw on the insight of community members to develop strategies to prevent crime and disorder-related problems. So the second one was problem solving and problem-oriented approach. The third one was decentralization, which is decision-making moves closer to the front lines, such as to patrol officers rather than police administrators. Community centers and are sometimes established in troubled neighborhoods. Officers removed from motorized patrols and instead patrol on foot or bicycles. Altogether, these three steps are intended to create better working relationships between the police and the people they police, ideas that were first proposed by Peel nearly 2 centuries ago. The idea of community oriented policing may be popular with politicians, police leaders, and researchers than with frontline officers who typically favor the traditional model of policing with its reliance on motorized patrol and rapid response. Moreover, despite the fact that their role in enforcing the laws accounts for less than a third of police activities, most police officers identify with the crime fighting role. So, Robertson in 2012, he questioned whether a community policing model truly reaches out to all members of the community or is simply paid lip service, suggesting that we spend more time talking about community policing than actually implementing the approach. Writing about the community policing movement, Marquis in 2016 observed that within the police studies literature, there is little agreement to what this movement actually is, why it appeared, or what it has accomplished. Yet, after almost 4 decades, uh, most police forces continue to insist that they are following its principles, and many academics reports on its genuine innovation. So, acceptance of community oriented policing has varied, and some police services have been reluctant to surrender much control to the public. In addition, one of the challenges of community policing is that these initiatives sometimes work best in healthy communities that are well organized and have low levels of crimes. In contrast, troubled neighborhoods um, often have to overcome their mistrust of the police before wanting to participate in community policing. So, according to the International Association of Chiefs of Police in 2014, um, it reported that in order for communities and law enforcement to build solid relationships, there must be an element of trust, fairness, and even respect. However, all of those coveted attributes must be earned through actions, not just words, and that takes time. This is some debate that, or there is some debate about the success of community policing and whether it will play a very important role in the future of policing. Layton in 2016 said that interest in community policing in Canada peaked in the 1980s, and the future of policing will have to be responsive to vulnerable people such as the elderly, the increasingly multicultural nature of Canadian society, the changing nature of crime due to technology, and confronting an ongoing fiscal crisis where policing costs are continuously increasing. So, James Septisky in 2017, a prominent police scholar from York University, observes that debates about the nature of policing should start with asking what matters in policing, and in other words, what is good policing? All of us will have different definitions about what constitutes good policing, but good police community relationships are a foundation for any successful crime control strategy. Moving forward to speaking about police structure in Canada. So, as of May 15, 2018, there were about 69,000 officers in Canada working in four basic types of police organization. The RCMP with over 18,000 officers who are also called members. They are the largest police service in Canada. The RCMP is responsible for federal policing and also contracts with 8 provinces and hundreds of municipalities to provide police services across Canada. The Ontario Provincial Police and Sûreté du Québec patrol the highways and the countryside as well as serve small towns in those provinces. There are also a number of regional police services, such as the Durham Regional Police in Ontario, that provide police services both in cities as well as in the surrounding countryside. And most Canadian officers work for local municipalities. These range in size from agencies with fewer than 10 officers to large police forces such as the Montreal Police Force, which employed over 4,500 officers according to the 2018 statistics. So, one of the cornerstones of community oriented policing is that police should reflect the characteristics of the community. And historically, the police could best be described as pale and male, but this is changing. By a report by Crosenius in 2009, the report stated that the police matrons, so who worked with female arrestees and juveniles who were detained, were employed by the Toronto Police Service in 1887. So the first police woman in Canada, Lurenessy Harris and Minnie Miller, were hired by the Vancouver Police in 1912, and a number of municipal services hired women officers over the next decade. However, it was not until 1974 when the largest Canadian police services, the OPP and the RCMP, trained their first women officers, and the proportion of women officers has been increasing ever since then. Over one-fifth, 22% of officers were women in 2018, and a growing number of them hold leadership positions. So, does having more women officers make a difference in police service? Researchers Carmichael and Kent in 2015 found that Canadian police services with a greater number of women officers killed fewer suspects. These researchers speculated that having a greater proportion of women officers changed the department culture, and their influence reduced the use of force. With respect to the reporting number of Indigenous and visible minority officers, it is difficult to show changes over time in the number of these officers, as much of the data about race and ethnicity is really based off self-reported information, which is not consistently collected and is incomplete. So Corner and his team report that while about one-fifth, 22.3% of Canadians are visible minorities, that only accounted for 8% of police officers in 2018. So in other words, there were only about 8% of all police officers who were visible minorities. In terms of officers of Indigenous ancestry, they accounted for 4% of all police officers, which was slightly above the representation in the national population, which is 5% of Canadians reported being of Indigenous ancestry. So when looking at the national averages, we should remember that there are some police services with much higher proportion of Indigenous officers, including many First Nations police services, and 30% of the Prince Albert Police Service officers are of Indigenous ancestry. And the growth in the proportion of visible minority and Indigenous officers is also want to note that the changes in women's policing are shown for over 30 years, while the statistics for visible minority and Indigenous officers only represent 5 years. Now, police consolidation. In addition to an increased focus on community involvement, there was a move to consolidate police services during the 1980s, and this shift was sometimes the result of regionalization, and it involved joining together several smaller agencies to form a single organization that served a number of cities or an urban region. An example is the Halton Regional Police Service, which was founded in 1974 when the municipal police services from 5 Ontario cities, Burlington, Oakville, Milton, Georgetown, and Acton, and several townships merged into a single agency. Some municipalities replaced their local police departments after contracting with the OPP, RCMP, and the SQ. Lithopoulos from 2014 reports that in 1988 there were 406 Canadian municipal police services, but this had decreased to 142 by 2012, a decrease of almost two-thirds. There has been a decrease in municipal police services in Canada from 1988 to 2012. While all provinces experienced a reduction in the number of municipal police services, the drop was greatest in Quebec, as the province lost 82% of its municipal police departments. Now, thinking about policing as an expensive proposition, so taxpayers across Canada are concerned about the rising costs of policing, and Coroner from 2018 reports that the per capita cost of policing in 2016 and 2017 was $405, which was an increase of about half since 2004 and 2005. Now, because municipalities use property taxes to fund police services, wealthier communities typically have more money for policing. So, large cities have some advantages when it comes to paying for police services. The cost of policing in small cities such as Saskatoon or Regina accounts for 20 to 25% of municipal budgets, while larger cities pay a smaller portion. In Toronto, for instance, the total budget for 2018 was 11.2 billion, and policing costs accounted for over 1.1 billion, which accounts for 10.5% of the city's total budget. And police services in largest cities are often uh, to their contain able to contain their costs because they can operate more efficiently. Whereas smaller communities, on the other hand, are really struggling to pay for police services. For example, the average per capita cost of policing in Canada was 405, as I mentioned, in 2016 and 2017. But for the 22,000 residents of Amherstburg, Ontario, the cost was about $658 a year. So, in order to save costs, smaller towns and cities have laid off officers and disbanded their local police services, and many are now contracting with larger policing forces. And there is a long history of contract policing in Canada, as small towns find it very expensive to operate a police department with only a few officers. In April 2018, the town council of Espanola, Ontario, voted to disband its 20-officer police service and contract with the OPP. While towns disbanding their police services can reduce police spending, the larger police service might not provide the same level of service, especially if no officers from the larger agency actually live in the community, thus reducing positive police community relationships. Now let's talk a bit about police strength. So, like any other human service agency, police services spend the greatest proportion of expenditures on staff salaries, and the number of officers per thousand residents is called police strength, and this rate varies throughout the nation. So, the number of police officers in various Canadian cities, let's say Montreal and Halifax, had the highest number of officers per 1,000 residents, so 2.3 and 2.2 officers respectively, while Kingston, Ontario, and Abbotsford, British Columbia had fewer than 1.5 or 1.4 officers per thousand residents. Ruddle and Thomas in 2015 found that crime explains some of the differences in how many police are deployed in Canada's largest cities, but that other factors also influence how many officers are really on the streets. And wealthier cities tend to have greater police strength, and communities that have their own municipal police service who employ more officers than cities contracting with the RCMP. And as a result, economic factors seem to play an important role in how the police are deployed. One possible reason for this finding is that politicians in wealthier communities may win votes by expanding the size of their police service, as hiring more officers is usually considered good politics. Now, speaking about rural policing, most police service or most police research or about research from police services is really conducted on large municipal police services, which is understandable given that only one fifth of Canadians live in rural areas. Now, given the vast spaces that must be policed, there are over 10,000 officers working in provincial policing, rural areas, small towns, and indigenous communities. Now, although we often think of the countryside as having a slow pace of life, homicide rates are actually higher in rural areas than in cities, and overall rates of crime severity also tend to be higher in rural Canada. A number of high profile rural crimes in 2016 and 2017 have led to an increased frustration of rural residents who feel unsafe as police response times are often very lengthy. So, for example, the Ottawa Police Service in 2018 reported that in 95% of the priority calls where there was an imminent danger of life, or imminent danger to life, I should say, an officer was on scene within 15 minutes. In a rural area, by contrast, the response time might be an hour or more, depending on where a crime occurs, the road, and the weather conditions, and the number of officers on patrol. And it might also be difficult for officers to find a farmhouse or other rural location if it is located off the main roads. So, something to think about. So, if we have a comparative view, let's say for the police strength, so Canada's place in the world, you would find most developed nations have about 2 officers per thousand residents in the population, and although many southern European nations have several times that number, for example, Greece, Belgium, Spain, and Cyprus have over 3.4 officers per thousand residents. So, when confronted with that statistic, scholars are curious about the reasons for this difference. And in order to better understand this issue, Radu and Thomas in 2009 conducted a cross national study of police strength and found that countries that have more violent crime had more officers on the payroll. In the first several studies, or a number of cross national comparisons that were made, these comparisons can be very tricky to evaluate due to the use of different definitions of crime and justice personnel or justice system personnel. The European statistics, for example, count border security guards as police officers, although Canada Border Services Agency officers are not classified as police in Canada. And the total number of police in Canada would be somewhat higher if these officials were counted. Now, given the findings from comparative studies, an interesting research question would be to look just at the differences in police strength in Canada. So, Carmichael and Kent in 2015 examined police strength in 40 Canadian cities between 1996 and 2006, and they report that police strength increased with the size of a city's minority population, income, and poverty rate. So these findings support a conflict perspective where scholars argue that the police are used to reinforce existing social relationships based on inequality by controlling the poor and minority populations. And Carmichael and Kent also observed that conflict theorists assume that the legal code not only reflects the interests of the powerful, but that the entire criminal justice system is a vehicle through which the dominant members of society enforce their views and regulate minority populations. So, rural policing is really carried out by the provincial police in Ontario and Quebec, and some municipal or regional agencies, such as the Peel Regional Police in Ontario, patrol both urban and rural areas. While those are exceptions, the remainder of National's rural areas are served by the RCMP, which has contracted with 8 provinces to provide policing until the 2030s, although the parties can opt out of these agreements with 2 years' notice. Now, shifting our focus to race, class, and gender, as well as policing Indigenous communities, where First Nation police service set up to fail, as many people say. So, in 1992, Canada became the only country that had developed a comprehensive national policing strategy for Indigenous people, known as the First Nations Policing Program, also known as FNPP. So the FNPP involves 3 levels of government, so federal, provincial, or territorial, and the First Nations. And police services operating under the umbrella of the FNPP served over 450 Indigenous communities. So about 1/3, 154 of those communities were policed by 36 self-administered Indigenous police services, while the remaining communities received police services from larger police forces such as the RCMP, OPP, and SQ. So, self administered Indigenous police services are very much like municipal police services, although the management and oversight of these agencies is undertaken by the chief and the band council rather than a mayor or city councillors. Whether Indigenous communities are policed by a self administered or contract police organization, Claremont in 2013 notes that policing Indigenous communities is challenging given the lasting effects of colonization or colonialism and the lack of economic opportunities in many First Nations. So, police officers also report that social problems in some of these communities are severe, ranging from substance abuse to family violence. Most Indigenous communities are located in rural areas, and policing costs increase while community well being, such as employment and health, decreases with the distance from urban areas. So, in addition, rates of crime and victimization of First Nations are several times higher than the national average. With respect to homicide, for example, Indigenous people represented almost a quarter of homicide victims in 2017, although they account for about 5% of the national population. In addition, the rate of Aboriginal persons accused of homicide in 2017 was 12 times higher compared to non Aboriginal accused persons. And given those challenges, one might assume that First Nation policing services would require more funding than municipal police services. So many self administered police agencies have struggled for the reasons I've just mentioned, and the Auditor General of Canada in 2014 reported that these agencies are chronically underfunded and expected to do their work under adverse conditions, such as not having enough officers to provide proper backup or provide timely responses to calls for service. And these are not new challenges, as Wes Liloff, former president of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, um, reported that these agencies were really set up to fail due to a lack of support and funding. A few researchers in 2017 examined the issue and found that these police services have been neglected by the federal and provincial governments, and these governments believe that by doing nothing or ignoring the problem, the challenges confronting Indigenous policing would somehow manage or resolve themselves. And this is in keeping with a long history of promising much but delivering little to Indigenous people. And given those challenges, one might ask why an Indigenous community would want to establish its own police service instead of leaving it to the RCMP, OPP, or SQ. One important concept underlying the FNPP is that it allows a community to take a step towards self determination, which means that they can control over some aspects of the justice system that had previously been denied to them due to the paternalism of government policies going back over a century. Now, moving forward to learning a little more about the role of police in Canada. So far, this review of Canadian policing has focused on the four different policing arrangements. So, federal, provincial, pardon me, so federal, provincial, regional, and municipal. And we have learned that most police officers are employed by municipal governments. Although officers may have different employers, there are a number of common elements in terms of the duties that officers carry out. So, a starting point in understanding the priorities of police service is really to review the agency's mission statement, which is a statement summarizing the agency's goals. For example, the Newfoundland Constabulary, which was one of the first policing agencies in Canada, provides the following mission statement. So they say, "We are committed to providing a fully integrated police service that fosters community relationships, partnerships, to build safe and healthy communities." Most Canadian police services express a similar set of values in their mission statements, including the protection of the public and emphasis on forming partnerships with communities. Although the content of mission statements may differ, the values outlined in these statements are important for the staff working in police agencies. So, McGuire and Dyke in 2012 analyzed responses from over 10,000 Canadian police officers in a survey about professionalism, and they found that over 80% of officers reported being very familiar with the values of their employers. Furthermore, about two-thirds of these officers identified with the values of the organization, and most officers believed that the mission statements were consistent with their beliefs about policing. Mission statements also clarify the broad priorities of police agencies, although more specific roles or guidelines for police services are defined in provincial legislation. For example, Section 11.1 of Ontario's Police Services Act spells out six main functions for police agencies in that province. So, 1. Crime prevention, 2. Law enforcement, 3. Maintaining public peace, 4. Emergency response, 5. Assistance to victims of crime, and 6. Any other prescribed policing functions. So, with these roles being similar for police services across the country, there is probably less agreement on which roles should be prioritized. For example, politicians and members of the public might disagree on whether crime prevention or law enforcement ought to be the most important priority. If law enforcement, or what some call crime fighting, occupies only a fraction of an officer's time, what other activities make up an officer's day? The key functions of the police, as highlighted in Ontario's Police Services Act, are described in the following sections. And the final category, and any other prescribed policing functions, is a catch all statement to account for future changes, as policing acts are rarely changed. So, Ontario's Police Services Act was in place from 1990 until a new act was introduced in 2018, and it only came into effect in 2019. Now, speaking of crime prevention, all of us would agree that it is more desirable to prevent crime than to respond to an offense that has occurred. Now, while increased attention has been paid to crime prevention, deterring potential offenders is difficult given the time or depending on the limited number of officers we can put on the streets. The National Academies of Sciences in 2018 described preventative or proactive policing as a priority on prevention, mobilizing resources based on police initiative and targeting the broader underlying forces at work that may be driving crime and disorder instead of waiting to respond to crimes that have actually occurred. The National Academies of Sciences also identified four proactive approaches. A. Focusing officer attention on high crime areas, so hotspots. B. Identifying crime related problems and developing solutions to those problems, which is a problem oriented approach. C. Targeting the small number of individuals who are responsible for committing a large number of offenses, such as some gang members. And D. Using the strengths of a community to identify and control crime. So ever since police vehicles were introduced, random preventive patrol, where officers patrol areas randomly throughout a community, was thought to deter potential wrongdoing and prevent crime. But with the exception of urban neighborhoods with the highest levels of crimes, police patrols are rare. In the suburbs, a patrol car might pass through a neighborhood only once a day, and this minimal police presence would not deter anybody motivated to commit an offense. Rural communities might receive even fewer patrols, and officers have reported that some remote villages in northern Canada might receive only one or two visits from the police each month. So, as police patrols are unlikely to have much of a deterrent effect on motivated offenders, other crime prevention approaches have been used. The police have been involving citizens in neighborhood watch programs for decades, and similar programs also exist throughout rural Canada and are known as Farm Watch in rural areas or as Cottage Watch in lakeside communities. So these programs encourage community members to report suspicious activities, behaviors, and people. The community members become the eyes and ears of the police. And although these programs have been around for a long time, we do not know how many of these groups are actually active, nor how many volunteers are involved in them. So Kang in 2015 found that few people actually participated in these organizations, And studies of neighborhood watch programs generally find that participation is highest with wealthier long term residents who own their homes. So, are these programs effective at all? Fingan in 2013 examined US neighborhood watch associations and observed that some of these programs suffer from a lack of training, poor organization, tendencies to target certain demographic groups, and overzealous interactions with suspects. Even if neighborhood watch programs are effective in deterring potential offenders, those individuals might just commit an offense in a place that has fewer people actively monitoring the neighborhood. So the issue of displacement, which was something to do with crime moving from one location to another. As a result, these programs might not reduce overall levels of crimes, but instead they might push offenders into less organized communities. Despite these limitations, neighborhood watch programs are low cost and enable the police and public to engage in partnerships. So it is likely that they will be around for a long time, and especially as they evolve using social media. There are a growing number of online groups where members post photos of unusual activities occurring or people acting suspiciously in their neighborhoods, but there are also dangers associated with these efforts. Writing about online groups based in Winnipeg, Marchand 2017 describes how some posts misinform readers or suggest that innocent people are wrongdoers, and some contributors have posted pictures or made comments that would violate someone's privacy. And despite those challenges, it is likely the number of people participating in these forums will increase. Now, moving our attention to law enforcement. So, although the crime prevention activities of civilians can deter some offenses, responding to crimes and conducting investigations are the two key roles carried out by the police. Their training and the manner in which the police are deployed and equipped enables them to respond to serious incidents or to investigate violent crimes. There is no shortage of laws to enforce, and because the police are spread relatively thin, with fewer than two officers for every thousand residents in all of Canada, political and police leaders establish enforcement priorities for their police services. Now, preventing and responding to crimes of violence are key priorities, but when it comes to property, traffic, and public order offenses, there is less agreement on what should be prioritized. With respect to preventing harm and saving lives, for example, some researchers have found that increasing traffic enforcement in Canada can provide a good return on policing dollars in terms of fewer deaths and collisions. Yet, aggressive traffic enforcement can also lead to tension between the police and the public, something to keep in mind. When it comes to policing, one controversial practice is when people on the street are stopped and questioned. These activities go by a number of different names, including stop, question, and frisk in the United States, guarding and street checks in Canada, and stop and search in the UK or United Kingdom. All of these practices involve collecting information from the individuals who are stopped but who are not under arrest, and the information about the individual is recorded in police databases. With respect to Canada, Tuluch in 2018 says there is a difference between carding and street checks. So, carding happens when an officer randomly asks an individual to provide identifying information when the individual is not suspected of any crime, nor is there any reason to believe that the individual has information about any crime. Whereas street checks occur when information is obtained by a police officer concerning an individual outside of a police station that is not part of an investigation. This is a very broad category of police information gathering, and much of it is legitimate intelligence gathering of potentially useful information. So, very few of us would say that stopping people randomly walking down the street is a good practice, but there are two views on street checks. Some believe it is good police work that enables officers to collect information on individuals in suspicious situations, such as officers stopping a person with a backpack at a time and place when many property crimes occur. The information obtained in these interactions can be used in investigating crimes, locating missing persons, solving crimes, and crime analysis. Others believe these practices are discriminatory and that individuals are subject to these interactions based on their race, ethnicity, or sexual preferences. Canadian studies have generally found that members of visible minority groups and Indigenous peoples are disproportionately likely to be carded. Warnica in 2015 reported that some young men in Ontario have been stopped dozens of times by the police, and similar studies in Western Canada found a similar overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in street checks. Most criminologists would say that carding and street checks have increased tensions between the police and minority communities, and as a result, several provincial governments placed restrictions on the way these checks can be carried out. While the number of street checks has declined, one problem is that violence is the largest Canadian in the largest Canadian cities has increased, and a number of police spokespeople say the two factors are related. The police in the UK also say that decreasing the number of stop and searches led to significant increases in violent crimes involving knives, including murders. All the research does not show a clear link between these stops and crime reduction. In New York City, by contrast, the violent crime rates dropped at the same time, and the practice of stop, question, and frisk ended. The problem with these observations is that they are not backed up with research, so we have no clear understanding of the impact of reduced street checks. In some places, there appears to be no rise in violence, while in other cities, violent crimes increased. As a result, the increase in violent crime could be caused by other factors such as higher involvement in gang activities. Although political and police leaders established priorities for policing, individual officers also have their own interests. Some officers will prioritize arresting impaired drivers, while others are more interested in intervening in incidents of family violence. Officers are generally free to use their discretion in their duties, which is a cornerstone of modern policing. Schulenberg in 2014 observes that discretion is the use of judgment in a given situation to take action or not in the form of verbal warning, formal caution, traffic ticket, or an arrest and charges being laid. One problem with discretion is that Canadians do not always agree on the types of offences that ought to be enforced. So most of us agree, however, that violent crimes should be investigated and the people involved in these crimes be brought forward before the courts. In addition to the seriousness of a crime, there are a number of other factors that an officer must consider before arresting a suspect. Some of these factors include the age of the suspect, whether the suspect was a leader or a follower in the offense, the relationship between the offender and the victim. Dawson and Houghton in 2014 examined the likelihood of arrest in incidents of intimate partner violence in Canada and found that recommendations that charges be laid increased when there were injuries, multiple victims, and incidents involving more serious offenses such as serious assaults, level 2 or 3, or even kidnapping. The researchers also found that charges were recommended more often in incidents with female rather than male victims, and those in intimate relationships rather than couples were also separated. Uh, Police officers' discretion also determines how sexual offenses are investigated and how these cases are managed. In a study carried out by the Globe and Mail, Doolittle 2017 found that police determined that about one-fifth of sexual assault claims across the country were unfounded, or in other words, no crime had occurred. One striking statistic in Doolittle's report was that the percentage of unfounded claims ranged from 2% in Winnipeg to 51% in St. John. That finding suggests that some police services are more likely to believe individuals who say they have been sexually assaulted. While we realize that police officers use their discretion in order to prioritize their activities, they are sometimes criticized because their decisions may be shaped by bias or stereotypes, and offenders and victims, whether that bias is conscious or not. As a result, officers' attitudes towards race, gender, ethnicity, age, or sexual preference may play a role when it comes to issuing a traffic ticket, arresting a suspect, or even using force. Nigo, Neot, Kala, Antonio, and Hickey in 2018 described the racial policing of minority groups in Calgary by the police, and the number of Canadian scholars have argued that over-policing of Indigenous and visible minority groups occur. So, maintaining the public peace with all that we have just spoken about, many calls for service received by the police are related to acts that reduce our quality of life, even though these acts might not be criminal in nature. Although definitions differ, order maintenance or maintaining order generally refers to taking action to ensure a sense of safety and comfort in public spaces. Order maintenance activities include responding to antisocial behavior, such as aggressive, rowdy, vulgar, and unruly activity. These acts range from verbally harassing people on the street, panhandling, noisy parties, public urination, prostitution, and groups of people taking over public spaces. Other such acts are directed at property and include littering and vandalism, posting graffiti, and illegally dumping garbage. The police often become involved when informal controls have broken down and people are reluctant to confront those who are engaging in such behaviors. The police typically attempt to resolve order maintenance issues in an informal manner, often by warning individuals rather than issuing citations or making arrests. Some aggressive order maintenance strategies have been introduced in 2000. The Ontario Safe Streets Act (SSA) came into effect. This legislation made it easier for police to crack down on acts that reduce the quality of life in public spaces, such as panhandling, squeaky cleaning, or the reckless disposal of used needles or condoms. O'Grady Gates and Bucherri in 2013 found that officers from the Toronto Police Service increased the number of tickets issued for these acts by 1,500% between 2000 and 2010. These researchers said that increasing the number of tickets was intended to control disorderly people as well as controlling the homelessness. Grady and colleagues in 2013 could not attribute the increased number of tickets to complaints from business owners or members of the public, changes in crime, which decreased, or the number of homeless people in Toronto, which also decreased during the same time. And because this law has been seen as criminalizing the behaviors of the poor and the homeless, the Fair Change Community Legal Clinic in 2018 launched a charter challenge to repeal the SSA. Now, order maintenance also involves formal responses to protests and demonstrations, an issue that has drawn considerable attention in the recent years. D. Lint in 2004 defined public order policing as the use of police authority and capacity to establish a legitimate equilibrium between government and societal, collective, and individual rights and interests in the mass demonstration of grievance. Public protests are a long standing Canadian tradition, and many of us are sympathetic to the issues and groups involved in these protests. We are, however, less tolerant of protests that infringe our movement or our quality of life, such as when a protest group blocks a highway or railroad or restricts our access to a business or a medical, educational, or social service agency. The police are sometimes reluctant to intervene in these protests. These situations are seen as lose-lose propositions, as no matter what happens in the confrontation, their actions will be criticized. So Molnar, Lehan, and Boyle in 2019, for example, contend that the response of the Toronto police to the G20 meetings in 2010 was one of the most significant contraventions of civil liberties in Canadian history. Moving on to our next section, which is the emergency response. The police are also expected to coordinate responses to emergencies or natural disasters where public safety or lives are threatened. Emergencies can include transportation-related incidents involving aircrafts, boats, or trains, and many of these incidents are relatively minor and responses are easily coordinated by a few officers. Some of these emergencies, by contrast, threaten the health and safety of large numbers of people. including the release of hazardous chemicals after the crash of a commercial truck or a train derailment. Natural disasters include ice storms, forest fires, floods, and tornadoes. While many of these originate in rural areas, they can have a significant impact on city dwellers, such as the wildfires that struck Fort McMurray, Alberta in 2016 and destroyed about 2,400 homes and buildings. The police are often first responders to disasters and they are tasked with managing these emergencies until further help arrives, which may take hours or days depending on the location of the community and the nature of the disaster. Officials from human or social service agencies also respond to emergencies and natural disasters. In addition to the police, responders include local fire departments and provincial and federal agencies such as the military or even Coast Guard. In addition, private organizations such as the Canadian Red Cross often respond to such disasters. All provincial and territorial governments have agencies that are tasked with preparing for disasters, for example, establishing plans and delivering public education, and also help coordinate responses to a major or long term disasters and the recovery afterwards. These agencies go by different names. One of the example is New Brunswick's Emergency Measures Organization. The other section that we should discuss is the assistance to the victims of crime. So, as noted earlier, police services are playing a larger role in providing assistance to crime victims. Allen in 2014 reports that over one third, so 36% of victim services were offered by police agencies, and that the police served almost 460,000 victims in 2011 and 2012. Although Canada has made progress in the treatment of victims of crime in terms of variety of services delivered to victims, Waller in 2014 argued that there is still a lack of attention paid to victims and especially to female survivors of sexual and family violence. When it comes to the actual services that police agencies deliver, Allen found that the most common types of interventions were A. Protection services, including safety training and learning how to assess the risk of victimization. B. Participation related services, such as accompanying victims to court, supporting victims when they are attending court, and helping with the preparation of victim impact statements. C. Crisis related services, which include responding to crises that victims are undergoing or debriefing these individuals after they have experienced traumatic incidents. D. Information services, such as what to expect from the justice system and how to access services. E. Medical services or anything that's related to medical services, such as escorting an assault victim to the hospital. And altogether, these services are intended to support victims in terms of psychological and physical healing and to help them make sense of the justice system. So, taking a closer look into police responses to the case of the Lac Mégantic train disaster. So, the police came to be involved in all aspects of a disaster, from being the first responders of the scene to the investigation of the aftermath. And the Lac Mégantic train derailment that occurred in Quebec town of 5,900 residents on the 6th of July 2013 provides an example of the roles of the police in a disaster. So 47 townspeople died and 40 buildings in downtown area were destroyed in the fire and explosions that followed the train derailment and the spillage of 6 million liters of crude oil. Immediately after the train crash and the explosions that followed, the police responded to the emergency and coordinated a response that included local community residents and volunteer firefighters. Dolsky in 2013 reports that 200 firefighters responded to the disaster, including some of neighboring U.S. towns. Once the immediate risks were contained and the fires extinguished, the Sûreté du Québec SQ played a key role in securing the scene, assisting in the evacuation of over 2,000 residents and recovering the remains of the people killed in this tragedy. The police also carried out a year-long investigation into the causes of the disaster. Ultimately, prosecutors determined that several company managers and executives, as well as The train's engineers were responsible for the tragedy. Three individuals were charged with 45 counts of criminal negligence causing death, which could have resulted in life sentences. Others were charged with lesser offenses that placed them in jeopardy of fines um, and maximum 6-month custody sentences. Similar to other serious and complex criminal cases, it took years to resolve the issue, and the trial of the three former railway co workers started uh, on October 2nd, 2017, and a jury found them not guilty on January 19, 2018, after deliberating the case for 9 days. Shortly before the fifth anniversary of the disaster in 2018, the Crown decided that it would not pursue a prosecution of the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic MMA Railway, as there was little chance of conviction. The bankrupt railway was, however, fined $1 million for violating the Fisheries Act, as the waters surrounding the accident scene were contaminated. Five former MMA workers were ordered to pay 50,000 in fines, and one worker received a 6 months probationary sentence. In addition to the employees who were punished, Irving Oil was ordered to pay 4 million for violating safety requirements under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act. Similar to the Westray mine disaster, nobody was ever imprisoned for their roles in this disaster. Did the inability to hold people accountable in this case affect future wrongdoing? What do you think? Um, the rail safety advocates say that 5 years after the Lac magnetic train derailment, not enough has been done to prevent similar tragedies, and that the number of runaway trains has actually increased by 10%, which is pretty problematic. Now, just to summarize our lecture, um, while Canadian policing has been evolving into its current state for the past 200 years, the most sweeping changes occurred in the past 5 decades. So, provincial standards, experienced leaders, and unionized police services have helped to increase the professionalism of officers. Um, Also, since the 1980s, the number of small town police agencies has decreased, and the smallest police services continue to disband. There are both positive and negative consequences of that change. Local politicians can contract uh, with regional, provincial, or federal police services to provide services more cheaply than maintaining their own police organizations. And larger agencies can be operated more cost effectively, but more importantly, those agencies can often be more selective when hiring, and they can provide more extensive training opportunities for career growth and more capable supervision. And on the other hand, many small town residents feel that their relationships with the police became more formal once they lost officers who lived and worked in the communities. Having said that, although we tend to think of police in their crime fighting role, responding to crimes and carrying out investigations accounts for only about 1/4 to 1/3 of their activities. And while these activities are the most important roles for the police, officers are also responsible for maintaining the peace, engaging in crime prevention, responding to emergencies, and providing services to victims. Police officers in a democratic society are given a unique set of powers to detain or use force on citizens. So we expect that they will be well trained and will act in a professional manner. Some scholars have argued that more effective police services can be provided if the demographic characteristics of those being policed are similar to the police. In Canada, the proportion of women officers has increased, and the Indigenous and visible minority officers is also increasing, although at a slower rate than women. There are about 2 officers for every 1,000 Canadians, which is less than many southern European nations. Yet there is also some variation in the number of officers deployed throughout Canada, and some cities have higher levels of police strength. Researchers examining the issue generally find that wealthier communities tend to deploy more officers, and even if they have less crime than their poorer counterparts. Other jurisdictions want to keep their property taxes low and deploy fewer officers. Some researchers point out that Vancouver residents pay 420 per capita for their municipal police, but the North Vancouver City government contracts with the RCMP and pays only 230 per capita. The main difference between the two cities is that North Vancouver, the officers have much higher caseloads and response times may be longer. Having described the roles and responsibilities of the police and the different arrangements across the nation, um, I hope we were able to look at some of the more controversial aspects of policing, including the recruitment of new officers, the existence of police subculture, and police mistakes and misconduct. These are some of the issues we hope to cover in future lessons. And the structures that we have developed to make the police more accountable will also be discussed. So, few things to keep in mind. One has to do with how Canadian policing evolved, why Sir Robert Peel's principles of policing are still relevant today, what some of the challenges are associated with Indigenous policing, what some of the advantages of the consolidation of many police agencies into larger police services are, and what the core roles are for different policing services. I look forward to seeing you guys in future lessons. Thank you.